Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people. Very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Gabriel Kuhn, who is the General Secretary of the SAC. Thanks for joining us, Gabriel.
Well, a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I guess just to begin with, could you tell us a little bit about what the SAC Syndicalisterna is?
Yeah, SAC. I've never thought of it. It sounds good in English, the SAC. The SAC is, you could say, the SAC, but it doesn't sound as good. It stands for Sveriges Arbetares Centralorganisation, the central organization of workers in Sweden. It is a syndicalist labor union. You have to correct me, but I would guess the closest in Australia would be the IWW in terms of principles. And like the IWW, the SAC was founded in the early 20th century, 1910 to be exact. It was split off of the radical factions among the labor movement, the union movement in Sweden at the time. And also, like many syndicalist organizations, it had its heyday in the 1920s, 30s, with about 35,000 members here in Sweden. Today, we are 4,000, so that's a significant difference. But we're still around. Have also had, which is kind of special in syndicalist history, there was never been a major split, and there's always been continuous activity in the union because the fighting in World War II never reached Sweden and there never was a fascist government. So the organization was always able to continue its work, even though there were difficult times. But yeah, and today I am the General Secretary. I was voted in last year.
I did have an opportunity to view a presentation by a member of the SAC or SAC recently. And one thing that intrigued me was the way in which the system of industrial relations in Sweden differs in many important respects to the Australian one. Can you elaborate on what that regime is and what the approach of the SAC is to, I guess, negotiating with government and capital?
I'm not sure what the comrade you listened to told you and what the main differences were that you noticed, but you will tell me afterwards because I'm very curious too. I don't know so much about the situation in Australia. The situation here in Sweden is that as I said before, as the SAC was an early split from the, let's call it the mainstream trade union movement, which has been very much dominated by the Social Democratic Party here in Sweden, which also agreed to what they call the Swedish model. Very early on in the 1930s, there was a contract signed between the Social Democratic trade unions and the bosses associations in Sweden that would regulate the labor market so that the government wouldn't have to get involved too much. And so essentially, if we break it down, make it very simple, it's that the leaders of these organizations, so both on the union side and the bosses side, they meet each year and then they agree on collective bargaining agreements for different branches and industries that are then basically copied pretty much nationwide. And then regulate the labor market, which means also that historically there haven't been that many strikes in Sweden, for example, and it's even become more difficult to strike just in recent years because there's been a reform in the labor law that now stipulates that except for a new round of collective bargaining agreements, when for some reason there is a conflict emerges around the new agreement that should be signed. Apart from that, there's essentially no possibility to go on strike at all. So with that background, the SAC as the more confrontational counterpart to the mainstream unions never participated in the Swedish model. So historically, we have hardly signed any collective bargaining agreements. It's now become a little difficult because of the new legal situation. So sometimes if you want to, since the conflict around the bargaining agreement is the only legal way to go on strike, that now can strategically be used to engage in confrontation with bosses. But historically, we have stood outside of that. And the accusation of standing outside the so-called Swedish model has always been the strongest argument by the mainstream unions against the SAC. We essentially undermine what they believe has been a great agreement that has led to the success story of the Swedish welfare state.
I think that the new situation you're describing in Sweden is the one that's basically obtained in Australia for the last century.
Okay.
So, yeah, and there's no legally established right to strike outside of authorisation by the industrial court system. So, yeah. And I don't know that there's been too many examples of unions or workers' organisations that have managed to escape that in Australian political and labour history. And obviously, you made reference to the Wobblies earlier. They also rejected the system of compulsory arbitration, but were smashed to pieces, basically, following the end of the First World War.
Okay. That, yeah, you I mean, I don't know, maybe
Welcome to Australia.
I just want to say maybe they were looking at Australia as an example when they, came up with the new law. Who knows? Yeah, very interesting. It's, I mean, even here in the neighboring countries, some of the details, especially legal details, are different, which ask for different union strategies, and at least if you work in that kind of field, it's always interesting to look at what that means in your daily practice. Then
also within Australia, I guess what's you might term the Swedish model or the Scandinavian model is looked at by many social democrats here as forming the basis for some kind of workers' paradise. I'm wondering if you can confirm whether or not that's the case in Sweden. Is it a workers' paradise?
Well, it certainly isn't today. If you look at the 1970s and 80s, I wouldn't call it a workers' paradise, but compared to other countries under capitalism, and make no mistake, capitalism has very much determined the development of Swedish society as well. It's sometimes been called, there was a famous book that came out in the US, I believe in the 1930s, called Sweden, The Middle Way, which presented the Swedish model as some kind of, well, as the title says, middle way between capitalism and socialism. I think that is somewhat misleading. It's certainly a very clear capitalist development, but the institutionalized labor movement was very successful in both establishing decent workers' rights and strong social security, strong wages, and also the social or the economic divides weren't that strong. So this is all relative. I think even in the 1970s, if you were the CEO of a state-owned company, you would still earn 6 or 7 times as much as the regular worker in the company, which is a very big difference. However, today the difference is somewhat like 30 times as much. So the income gaps have increased enormously. In the 1990s, also as just part of a general international wave, the Social Democrats here turned neoliberal, so there was a lot of privatization, which also led to a decrease of the powers of the union. So a lot of the social welfare state has since been eroded. And on top of that, because of labor migration, you now have what you essentially can call an underclass. Some people might call it the precariat. People, a section of the working class, mainly consisting of immigrant workers that often completely fall outside of the social welfare state, have very few protections at the workplace in terms of rights. And this is actually the main constituency of the SAC membership today. So most of our members, especially here in Stockholm, belong to what I just referred to as this new underclass in Sweden. So if possibly the idea of a workers' paradise made some kind of sense if you were very generous in the 1970s and 80s and compared to other countries, it's very far from today's reality.
Why is it that the other trade unions in Sweden don't engage with this precariat?
A lot of it has to do with the fact that they have a very traditional set model of membership that's tied into very strong bureaucracy here in Sweden. There is, for example, the so-called personal number that everyone who is documented here has and uses for all sorts of things, including your union membership. So to begin with, if you do not have this personal number, just for reasons of formality, it's not possible to join some of the bigger unions. Plus, also traditionally, their entire membership model is based on a more classical idea of mass workers at big companies, long-term steady employment, and then you have your factory groups, etc. With this new underclass or precariat, we are looking at workers who change their workplaces a lot, who get to their workplace through temp agencies, who sometimes only stay in the country for a few months. So they simply do not fit the organizational model of those unions, while we, for different reasons, prove to be more flexible with all those rules. So it's much easier for them to come here. Plus, I'm tempted to say we care more about that part of the working class than the social democratic unions do. So that's why we make bigger inroads into that part of the proletariat.
Gabriel, there's currently a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in Sweden. You've got this coalition between various right-wing parties, and including the Sweden Democrats, who started out as a sort of far-right, maybe even neo-Nazi group, who are now pushing anti-immigration policy that's sort of is trying to maybe rival even Australia for cruelty. Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening in terms of immigration policy in Sweden and this sort of motley coalition?
Sure. So to be precise, what happened after the last elections was that a center-right coalition government was formed. The Sweden Democrats are not part of that coalition. However, the coalition is a minority government that is entirely dependent on the Sweden Democrats' support. So the Sweden Democrats could say tomorrow that for whatever reason they no longer support the government, which means that there'd either be new elections or they'd have to try to find new coalition partners or whatever. It would cause what they call a political crisis in the country, which also means that the coalition, the Sweden Democrats basically can dictate, what they expect the coalition to do. And they were also in a symbolic sense, the importance of the Sweden Democrats was very clear when the coalition presented itself as the new government after the last elections, because the leader of the Sweden Democrats, Jimmie Åkesson, was not just part of that official presentation. He also spoke much longer than any of the leaders of the other parties, which also has to do with the fact that the Sweden Democrats actually are the second strongest party in the country after the Social Democrats. So they got more votes than any of the three parties that now formed the government coalition. So that illustrates the political power that they have gained. And they've always, the big thing, you were right to point out that the origins of the Sweden Democrats lie in the neo-Nazi movement of Sweden of the 1990s. And when I say that, I don't mean just, anti-immigrant people that left-wing people kind of don't like. I mean, it was the explicit neo-Nazi scene that party evolved from. And nowadays, of course, they present them as some kind of nationalist, conservative party that doesn't have links to far-right groups and organizations, which for anyone who researches their membership is very clear that is not true. But so essentially their main issue has always been that the social problems that we see in Sweden today are not caused by the economic system. They are caused by what they call mass immigration. And so to cut down on immigration, to limit essentially the numbers of people who come here is a big thing, which is their main agenda. And concretely, that means, for example, now that it's much harder to get asylum in Sweden, that it's much harder to bring family members into the country. There have been discussions now that even if you have received permanent residency, that might be revoked again. It's much harder for people to gain citizenship than it was before. There's even some discussion about repatriating people to their countries and how that could be done. And I think recently the government, so this is not even the Sweden Democrats, so this is a member of the government coalition, was very proud that for the first time in years, I believe, the immigration from Sweden last year was higher than the immigration. So this is part of the political climate that we live in Sweden today. Unfortunately, it's no different in many other European countries. But what's probably surprising, I think even to people in Sweden, at least a certain segment of the population, is that it has become so pronounced in a country that, as we talked about before, often was seen as a social democratic / liberal sort of bastion in the European context.
That kind of sentiment and those political perspectives seem to be becoming increasingly popular in various parts of Europe. We saw just recently that the AfD in Germany has had some success. What's your reading of the situation, I guess, in Europe more broadly in terms of these far-right and fascist political forces?
One could talk about it forever. The very short version, I believe, is that we've seen social and economic crisis, kind of a permanent crisis since, let's say, the 1990s. And unfortunately, the far-right response has been much more effective than the response from the left. I think there are various reasons for that. I do believe that the analysis on the left is correct, which has more to do with class relationships, change in geopolitics, power shift away from Western Europe to other players. So there's a struggle for both economic but also cultural hegemony, where Europe has a much harder time to stay on top than it did 50 years ago. All of this affects, of course, social relationships, the whole neoliberal turn. So I think that analysis is correct, but the practical response on the left has been very weak, while the right has really capitalized on the crisis in ways that are characteristic for those kind of political movements. Simple suggested solutions, scapegoats, immigrants, minorities, woke people, whatever. There's a whole group of people that are seemingly responsible for the problems that we have in these societies, who aren't responsible, but people buy into that. And I think also on the organizational level, if you look at the Sweden Democrats, and I have to say, working for an organization here that is historically part of the Swedish left. It's kind of devastating to see how successful the organizational attempts on the right have been, because if you look at, and I think the Sweden Democrats are a very good example for that, and I mean, it's been a huge success story in the sense that, as I said, the movement started from very marginal groups, political groups in Sweden in the 1990s, to now being a major power player. And the core of this party is essentially a handful of people who've known each other since they've been teenagers, and I think just had a long-term plan, stuck to it, obviously good in enforcing discipline within their own ranks. They're patient. Should also say that with right-wing organizing, where you don't think so much about democratic elements and rotation of power and all of that, sometimes that allows you to follow long-term goals in a more effective way than I think in some of the leftist groups. I think that is a factor. But anyway, so yeah, we've just seen an organizational success on the right as a response to a social crisis that we haven't had on the left. And the election results is that we see now is just one of the consequences.
More broadly, Gabriel, there's a war going on in the Middle East, a war on Gaza. What impact has that had upon Swedish politics and society?
I think the biggest impact of the war, and it's not so much, I think there are two aspects here. One is you could look specifically at the war in Gaza and the impacts on Swedish society, which I think are relatively limited. It certainly mobilized protests against the war, which are fairly strong, but could be stronger. And it's the sort of usual suspects that are involved. There's a ranges from human rights activists to left-wing organizations to organized immigrant groups. On overall politics in Sweden, I don't think that the impact of that particular conflict has been that strong. However, if you tie it to, for example, the war in the Ukraine and the overall security situation, as they call it, and what's now been tied into it, an extreme militarization in Europe, then the impact has been huge. And I mean, especially in Sweden, which is now a member of NATO, which just 2 or 3 years ago would have been unthinkable. And that, of course, that process started with the war in Ukraine. But I think the war in the Middle East now just kind of confirms the sense among people that there'll be increased military conflicts. You have to have strong military partners, and therefore NATO membership, for example, is a good thing, which then also means that if we tie it back to the conflict in Gaza, if you're a member of NATO, clearly you in various ways are more connected to one side of that conflict, which is in practice a NATO partner. And plus, I mean, Sweden, one of the strongest industries here is the weapons industry. So that's one of the dirty secrets of Swedish history. Also in relation to the welfare state, a lot of the money that's been used for that has come from exporting weapons to all sorts of conflicts around the world. So yes, the most positive political consequence of this is that there's been a certain mobilization of parts on the left, and also the anti-imperialist tradition that exists in this country.
You've kind of, in your other work, your other writings, you've dedicated some time to translating and excavating from history various texts and persons and movements, especially in relation to anarchist and radical history. Why is that so important to you? What drives you to want to bring these things to light?
I think there are two aspects. There's a subjective and an objective aspect. So the subjective one is, maybe I just have this nerdy side where it's a personal interest to look at histories of resistance and what people were able to do, And so there's this sense of course, you get inspired, but beyond that, I think the more objective motivation is, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's true. If you are discontent with the current state of affairs and you are thinking a lot about what you both individually and collectively could do to change things, there's a lot to learn in history. I mean, sometimes I'm amazed at, and it's also kind of saddening. You look at conflicts 100 years ago, and although a lot of it was very different, things have changed dramatically in the past 100, even just 30 years with all the digital revolution and all of that. Since the structure of the system we live in are still very similar, a lot of the resistance movements and the problems they encountered were very similar too. And so I think it's very interesting to see why, certain movements historically failed. And even if that was 100 years ago, I think you can learn things about political activism today. If I take one concrete example from my home country, Austria, where there was a civil war in 1934 between the far right and workers' militias, and the workers' militias lost, which led to the so-called Austro-fascist regime for 4 years and then the takeover of the Nazis. I mean, if you look at that event and you think that, well, what if the workers' militias had won? What would the outcome have been, and how different perhaps would the course of history has been? It's very interesting to look at, and if you look at it, it's not that possibility was completely unrealistic. And so you start looking at, okay, so why did it turn out the way it turned out, and why didn't it turn out that other way? And if we find ourselves in a similar situation today, and now we don't have to start talking about armed struggle in Europe right now, it's not on the agenda, but the conflicts are still very similar. You have a far right threat that with strong fascist elements, and then you have parts of society that still have the ability to resist that, including workers' organizations. Then I think it can be very beneficial to look at those concrete historical examples. So I think that it's kind of a nerdy personal side plus a political conviction that we today as political activists, left-wing political activists, can learn something from that history.
Well, Gabriel, thanks so much for coming on. If people want to find more of your work, they can find a lot of books published through PM Press. You also have a blog at left23, that's the words, .org. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks again for having me. It's great chatting.
That's our show. We'll be back next week.
We will. We'll see you then.
Most of us agree that we deserve to be paid for the work we do, not the number of candles on our birthday cake.
But Australia's current workplace laws allow employers to pay a lower minimum wage to someone just because they're younger.
It's an unfair and confusing system that costs young workers in Australia around $3 billion a year, and it's mostly pocketed by big multinational companies.
These junior rates are based on the unfair and outdated assumptions about people's living costs. But times have changed, and it's time the rules change too.
Boomers, millennials, Gen Z or alphas.
We may describe it differently, but we all know what fairness is.
It's time for fair wages for all ages.
For more information, go to fairwages.org.au.
Victorian Trades Hall Council is a 3CR supporter.
Stand in solidarity with Palestine this Sunday.
Hi, it's Nasser Mashni from Palestine Remembered, Australia's only dedicated show on Palestine. Join me every Saturday morning at 9:30 and very importantly, get along to our rallies. Sunday, 12 o'clock, State Library. Join us.
We have to mobilise to show our support for Palestine. 12 p.m, State Library, this Sunday.
Rally to demand freedom and justice for Palestine. No war on Gaza.
Free Palestine Melbourne is a 3CR supporter.